Welcome to the Leadership Lyceum, a CEO's virtual mentor. Now, here's your host, Tom Lindquist.
Glad to have you back in the Leadership Lyceum, where we bring you direct access to top CEOs and directors of boards in an interview format that provides insight on situational issues that confront CEOs every day. It is a CEO's virtual mentor. After a bit of a hiatus, we're back. I can assure you we've been busy on your behalf in the interim. We're delighted to announce that we formed two companies under Leadership Lyceum's brand. Lyceum Leadership Consulting, which provides executive and board of directors search, board effectiveness review, and an array of services for successor development and board readiness. And Lyceum Leadership Productions, which brings you this podcast. We'll be expanding the programming of the episodes this summer, so please subscribe through iTunes and give us feedback. Tell us about leadership situations you're interested in us exploring. Please visit our website at leadershiplyceum.com for all of our archive media and offerings. Welcome to this special episode of the Leadership Lyceum, a CEO's virtual mentor, focused on innovation in an industry that many of us take for granted. We take an in-depth look at innovation in the electric utility industry. It's the Leadership Lyceum's opening act to Edison Electric Institute's annual industry convention that starts this weekend, June 11th, in Boston. In this episode, we take a look back at last year's convention in Chicago, where we conducted 10 interviews that included 8 CEOs from the electric industry, covering all points along the electricity value chain, from generation to transmission to distribution to the customer meter and beyond. We also have the perspective of a president of a venture capital-backed technology provider to the industry, as well as the critical viewpoints of the regulator, with the president of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, or NARUC. Rather than introducing our guests up front, we'll introduce them as we bring them into the conversation. By way of context for our broad listenership, Edison Electric Institute, or EEI, is the association that represents all U.S. investor-owned electric companies. EEI provides public policy leadership, strategic business intelligence, and essential conferences and forums for the industry. As a bit of an appeal to our broad listenership, why should you care about this industry? Well, its influence and impact is far-reaching and profound. The member companies of EEI provide electricity for 220 million Americans, operate in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, and directly or indirectly employ more than 1 million workers. We'll be right back to get the program underway. Just prior to our interviews last year, Neil Irwin, senior economics correspondent for the New York Times, gave us inspiration in his walk down the memory lane of innovation in his May 15th, 2016, The Upshot column titled Tracking Down the Golden Age of Innovation. He posited in that article that a better way to understand the significance of technological change may be to come as close as we can to actually walking through those time periods, from the end of the Civil War to present, and understand the way we lived, ate, traveled, and clothed and entertained ourselves. Through our conversation with these industry leaders, we'll attempt to walk you through our current age of innovation in the electric power industry. So without further ado, here we go. Segment 1, Opening Statements and the Structure of the Industry. We'll begin with Mr. Travis Kavula, Commissioner, Montana Public Service Commission, and at the time was serving a term as president of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, or NARUC.
If you go back to square one with why do we have utility commissions, it's to regulate monopoly service providers in a manner that simulates what would happen in a competitive market if there were one. And so that's something regulators always need to keep in mind. And they often fall into the trap of reviewing actions the utility has taken, as is their job, and deciding whether or not those actions are prudent or not. But that causes some upswing risk, I'd say, of utility decisions that seem more risky, or another way to say that is more innovative, because the prudence of their actions, if they fail to pan out, are going to be called into question. So that dynamic almost inherently encourages the status quo to have this kind of inertial effect. It's really the job of the regulator to not only, in my view, second guess the prudence of actions taken, but also second guess the prudence of inaction. And that's fundamentally a dynamic that I try to talk about to all of my colleagues in the regulatory community. Are there better ways of doing things? And how do you induce utilities to perform?
Mr. Steve Berberick, CEO of California ISO. The ISO is one of the world's largest transmission organizations, managing the electric grid and wholesale power markets for 30 million Californians.
The critical thing for utilities in our industry in general is we can take some lessons, I think, from the technology industries and other industries where technology evolved and the industry didn't. I think it's incumbent upon us to take that lesson and know that we all have to foster the technology as opposed to trying to contain the technology. Because if we fight the innovation, you're going to have major breakpoints. That's what you've seen in industry after industry that's been through a change process. If we embrace it and we manage to it, I think we can have a thriving industry instead of having breakpoints. Instead of having guerrilla warfare around the edges all the time, kind of like what's going on now, as you see between the utilities and the solar developers as an example.
Mr. Tony Early, Executive Chair of the Board of PG&E Corporation in San Francisco. At the time, was Chairman, CEO, and President of PG&E.
Utilities are going to have to realize that the world is changing and not try and stop it from changing. I mean, the utility business has been incredibly successful for the last 1.25 centuries or so, but we do need to change, and we need to embrace some of these new technologies, try and partner with a number of these other players, and they talk about disruptive technologies, but I view them as partners in future technologies that we've got to work with. In fact, EEI has a number of forums where we've brought in innovators in the energy space, and whether it's information systems or whether it's hardware improvements, and working with them and trying to partner them up with utilities to see what works and what doesn't work. And one of the great things about the utility industry is we have a long history of collaboration with each other and sharing information. So I think that will help us accelerate the development of some of these new technologies as we find, okay, this works, this doesn't work. We're likely to share it with others at conferences like this that will move the adoption of these new technologies along. And we've got to work with our regulators. One of the real challenges will be that the regulatory environment has been developed over the last 100 years, and it's got to change as rapidly as the technology is changing. And obviously regulators have to set boundary conditions, but they need to let utilities be innovative and work with these new partners coming in.
Mr. Ralph Izzo, CEO of PSEG in Newark, New Jersey.
So if you look at what I would call, in general terms, the supply side of the energy world, and you look at the efficiency of large power systems, gas turbines, steam power plants, whether fueled by oil or coal, in the older eras and more recently, more exclusively by nuclear and coal. We've just done tremendous things over the decades in making that part of the value chain far more efficient. And I would say that that's been pretty much the domain of large companies. I think here we're seeing much more in the way of smaller entrants to the market that are doing some wonderfully creative things in terms of home energy management, more efficient appliances, whole building energy management. And that's been an area that historically the utility has not participated because somewhere, somehow, once upon a time, an imaginary boundary was drawn at the meter.
Mr. Nick Akins, CEO of AEP in Columbus, Ohio. At the time of the interviews, the outgoing chairman of EEI.
We are in an industry that's transforming considerably
And our industry is focused on really three components: infrastructure development, development of the infrastructure that supports really that kind of interaction with the grid, interoperability of different types of components, different types of technologies. And of course, we're also still focused on many other aspects of what's going on with the industry itself in terms of rehabilitation of the grid, cybersecurity, physical security. Those are technological components too that are being added that weren't there before. But this whole notion of interoperability and what role the utility plays is extremely important. It really goes to the fact that we've always been a system that was built around one-way flow of power. Data flow was very limited from generation, where we obviously made the product, transmission to transport the product, and distribution, where we distributed the product. And it was really a one-way notion of focusing on this is the power and energy you get, customer, and the customer interaction side was very limited as well. And customers really couldn't make decisions about how they wanted to use the product that we deliver.
Again with Steve Berberick, California ISO CEO, with a final comment for this section.
We've always planned a system, a thermal-based system: coal, nuclear, gas, and maybe you had some renewables. Now we have to plan the system. It's a renewable-based system complemented with the other stuff, and it's a paradigm shift. And the key thing is, how do you move all those things together?
Let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back to pick up again with Steve Berberick on interoperability and how these complex systems work together. This is segment 2, interoperability, data, and the customer. We're back with Steve Berberick, CEO of California ISO, on the subject of interoperability of complex components of the electricity value chain. He'll mention solar installations on home rooftops.
On a broad perspective, the changes are occurring here. In California, we're adding about 11,000 rooftops a month of distributed generation. And if I were sitting here a year ago, I would have told you it was 7,000 rooftops a month. The second element, so that's about 70 megawatts a month of distributed generation that we're adding to the system. On a parallel track, we continue to add renewables, central station renewables to the system. Solar, wind, geothermal. And on any given day now, we may serve 40% of our load with renewables. And we've hit north of 50% of our load with renewables on a few occasions. So the growth is there. We've gotten services, for an example, from the thermal fleet, reactive power, ramping, all of those things. Well, we're going to have to get them from the renewable fleet. So you have to think through, how do I now get things from the renewable fleet that I used to just rely and know were there from the thermal fleet? And those are the changes that we're trying to manage. But they hit us in a number of places. Planning the system. We know that we need to have voltage support, as an example. In the West, unlike the East, we have very long transmission lines. Requires a lot of voltage support. The renewables need to help us with that. Ramping gets a lot more difficult because you have a low net load, and it grows very quickly, particularly in the shoulder months, in the fall, particularly after Thanksgiving, when the Christmas lights and holiday lights come on. So ramps are extreme as well. The other element is capacity. We've seen in other areas, like Germany, the price of capacity has gotten crushed. So what now becomes important? The coin of the realm now is flexibility. And our markets now have to be designed to compensate for flexibility as opposed to capacity. Well, let's talk about the innovation that has to occur for us to be able to handle this. First, when you talked about variability just a minute ago, we optimize the system every 5 minutes. That optimization is very powerful to be able to handle the intermittency. And the intermittency hasn't been such a problem because of the ability to be able to optimize the system and do a look ahead. and it's all technology-based. And imagine the computing power you need to have to solve for that equation. Second, in a thermal-based system, you tell the facilities what to do. In a renewable-based system, you have to forecast what they will do, because with wind and solar, they will move around. And forecasting then becomes really, really important. And I'm talking about meteorological forecasting. What's the wind speed going to be? What are the microclimates like? What about cloud cover? The opacity. How much are you going to get if there's a light cloud cover versus a clear day? So we've really had to ramp up our ability to be able to know how the weather impacts our generation.
Nick Akins, CEO of AEP in Columbus, Ohio.
Particularly in light of the additional distributed resources that are being added to the grid, there's no doubt that we're going to see the focus on renewable technologies, on storage technologies, energy storage, which is something that we're very focused on, but also ensuring that we're able to utilize the grid in very different ways to optimize power flows. Today, vastly different, and you're seeing partnerships develop with utilities focused on making sure not only is there bidirectional flow of power and energy, but also bidirectional flow of data. And the big data analytics and those solutions are driving opportunities for us to analyze the energy grid on an instantaneous basis and make adjustments that need to be made. There's that trusted relationship. And I think we have been, as an industry, and I probably shouldn't speak for the industry on this, but AEP, but I'm sure others would agree, have been less focused on the customer than we should be. And there is no doubt technology is that bridge for us to establish and maintain that relationship with our customers and ensure that we continue to grow as an industry.
But what triggered this new customer focus and this proximity to the customer?
Primarily, it was the advent of smart meters and big data solutions that are driving efficiencies in the grid and the ability for a multitude of different types of resources being deployed. Used to, we only decided whether it's going to be a nuclear unit, a coal unit, or a natural gas unit. And today, it's across the board in terms of technologies. That includes renewables, that includes energy efficiency, that includes optimization of the grid itself to drive capacity. Those are clear areas where if you look at our resource plan for the next 10 to 15 years, it's 4,000 megawatts of solar, 5,000 megawatts of wind, 3,500 megawatts of natural gas, and the rest is energy efficiency and smart grid-related activities. So you can see the dynamic changing, and it's being driven by customers' preferences toward a clean energy economy, and also in terms of the customer experience itself, and that perfectly aligns with what EEI is doing. And during my chairmanship of EEI, we had strategy sessions focused on this issue because it was so important to the industry.
Tony Early, PG&E in San Francisco.
PG&E was fortunate enough to be one of the first utilities that had about 100% coverage on smart meters. And originally, smart meters were touted as a way for customers to figure out how much electricity they were using and could reduce their electric bill by monitoring it more effectively. And that's all true, but the reality is it's driving incredible innovation because it's giving utilities more information than they ever had about how their system operates. I mean, in the old days, we didn't know a customer's out of service till the customer called us up. And once we got the smart meters on, a light went off that said, oh, by the way, if a storm goes through or if there's a problem, we can find out within minutes. We just ping the meters and they tell us whether they're on or off. So we know exactly how many customers are out, where the outage is. We can probably pinpoint what type of outage is by looking at the pattern. So that moved us to the next level of starting to innovate by attaching those smart meters through our computer systems to automated switching units. So instead of having to roll a truck to isolate a problem, we can now automatically, based upon what the computer is telling us about the outage, reroute power so we can shrink 1,000 customer outage down to a 10 customer outage in a matter of minutes. And then you take it to the next step. Those meters also give us some information about the flows through the meter, the voltages in the meter. We now have millions of points of contact out there where we know what's going on out there in the system. And we're just scratching the surface on how to use that data in ways that are useful to us. And we've got all kinds of software developers that are out there that are working on energy issues coming to us saying, well, if we could use your data, here's what we could tell you about how your system is out. We could do diagnostics on your system, so we could tell you to fix it before it actually breaks. And it's this incredible synergy between the tech community, the utilities, and the IT community being able to use that data. A major change. All this data we're getting is, how do we increase the quality of the service and the types of services we can provide for our customers without them having to think about it? And that's what these innovative technologies are doing. When we talk about electric vehicles becoming more and more prevalent, your electric system and your smart meter will work together with your electric vehicle. It will tell the vehicle when to charge based upon the time of use rates. It may even be a source of power if there is a power outage and your car is parked there, to give you some power back while you're waiting for the power to come back on.
Mr. Alex Lasky, co-founder and president of Opower. Alex sold his company to Oracle while we were at the convention in June of 2016.
Over time, it's become more and more clear that the customer relationship is increasingly strategic and important to utilities. If I think about why are utilities interested in their customers, I think there are, generally speaking, three big changes that have happened during the time we've been in existence as a company. The first is that post-recession, there seems like there is decoupling of energy consumption and GDP. So we see for the first time since the days of Thomas Edison that GDP is growing, but per capita energy consumption in the developed world is flat or even declining. That's one thing. The second fact is that in the last decade, cost curve on solar has come down so significantly that utilities, although it's a stretch to say utilities have genuine competition that could put them out of business, it isn't a stretch to say that customers have options. If solar costs continue to come down and storage has the promise that some people believe it will have, that certainly for the first time ever, even if there isn't a threat to the utility itself, there's a threat to the central generating plant. And more of the generation that's coming online is distributed rather than centralized. And that, of course, also, since Thomas Edison, Pearl Street Power Plant, downtown New York, the utility industry has been able to count on the first fact, rising demand, and the second, the need for a central generating plant. The third thing has been just essentially a change in customer expectations and customer desires. And this has come, I'd argue, largely from outside the industry, but each of us has many service providers in our lives, and it probably has been 15 years that you've been doing business with your bank online and they've had your email address. But really, if you think even the last 10 years, the kind of information services you do, your other service providers provide. Today, you buy mobile tickets, you buy tickets for your plane on your iPhone. 10 years ago, the iPhone didn't even exist. Today, you get text messages when your flight's delayed. It wasn't that long ago that you had to get to the airport, stand in some long queue to find out why there was a delay. Now you can do it from your living room couch. And so, as customers to all these service providers, we want the same kind of experience from our utility. So I think all three of those have forced, namely, flat or declining demand, competition from decentralized, distributed generation, and rising customer expectations have all led to a utility that is much more focused on its customers than had been in the past. And then, of course, the distributed generation and potentially distributed storage over time provides a potential competitive threat to the utility. And so, if they're going to, they need to increase loyalty among their customer set. They need to increase, the sets of products and services that they provide to their utility customers so as to move their business forward and to secure those relationships.
Mr. Pedro Pizarro, CEO of Edison International, at the time the president of Edison's subsidiary, Southern California Edison.
And I would say that we've gotten the benefit that was initially conceived for the smart meters, which was to be able to avoid human meter reading. That was good.
Yeah.
But it also helped safety a lot because meter reading is a fairly hazardous profession. I think there's a whole other level of much smarter meters and much smarter uses of that data that we're just starting to scratch at now. And frankly, our vision on the utility side is being able to truly access that data coming off of the smart meters and use it for operations in a real-time or near real-time way, so that the idea that a customer has to call us to let us know that the lights are out, I like that to become an outdated concept. We should know that the lights are out because we should be able to read the smart meters and understand what's happening. We should be using the data to redirect our operations to serve customer needs. That's one form of customer data. But there are other forms of customer data coming our way. As we monitor usage through the smart meters and we see how customers are responding to price signals, as we have more customers on time of use, as we look at the introduction of more demand-side resources, those are also data streams coming from the customer. Now, mind you, there is an ongoing dialogue in California about where is the line or where's the balance between using that information and making it more broadly available, at least in aggregate form, so that the market can benefit from it, versus what data do we need to hold confidential in order to protect customers' interests in an era where both privacy concerns and cybersecurity concerns are really at the forefront. So that's an ongoing discussion about the use of that data.
We'll be right back with segment 3, boundary conditions, to talk about the boundaries that utilities place around their provision of service. Stay tuned. We're back with segment 3, boundary conditions, and how utilities are defining the boundaries of their service. Mr. Warner Baxter, CEO of Ameren Corporation in St. Louis.
At the end of the day, we have been and will continue to be not just in the energy business, but we're in the customer business. And all these advanced technologies, from my perspective, are going to give us an opportunity to serve our customers even better. We really believe that the grid is going to be the chief enabler to bring real value to our customers.
Pedro Pizarro, Edison International.
In our utility side, that is a major opportunity in terms of investment for our investors. So we're investing to the tune of $4 billion a year, and most of that is going into wires infrastructure. We have a very light footprint in terms of generation. We, over the years, have largely certainly exited the competitive generation market. We have about 15 to 20% of our electrons that are produced by our own utility resources. But for the most part, we're in the market and most of our capital is going into wires. Now, as we think about how the utility is serving customers, that simplifying into two big buckets. One bucket is the traditional provision of that network and all that means. But the second bucket is looking at what things we need to be doing to enable customers to make their own technology choices on the edge of the grid, largely on the distribution side of the house. That, for the most part, means that we stay on our side of the meter, but there have been examples already where we're doing some things on the customer side of the meter. Whether it's we have a charge-ready program to help deploy electric vehicle charging infrastructure. We're actually building out infrastructure all the way down to the last stub that goes into the customer-owned charger. Or we're contracting with third parties that are aggregating storage resources on the customer side of the meter. So there's some greatness to that line, but I think that the core theme is we're providing the robust infrastructure to enable all these technology choices to happen.
Steve Berberick, California ISO.
I think we have to look at what we're good at and what we're not good at. And can we innovate, and can we distribute, and can we build a market as well as nest? I don't know. I would argue maybe that's not our best thing. But what are we good at? We're good at running a network. And as you take apart what Nest will do, and what the homes will do, and what aggregators will do, and what solar providers will do, and what battery people will do, they all need the network. And I think evolving the network so that it can participate in that new paradigm is maybe what we need to think about from an innovation perspective. As you put electric vehicles on the system and rooftop solar on the system and advanced demand like Nest would provide you, you get a lot more moving parts than you had before. Someone has to orchestrate that. I would argue that utilities in particular are well positioned to orchestrate that. So now we're providing network services, all right? Now that may look like telecom. Now how does telecom bill for their services? You know, in your cell phone, you pay $100 a month. You don't pay $1 a call, and that's how I think we have to evolve the utility industry. It's a high fixed cost business. It charges variably. That has to change as you evolve into this network operator too. I think when businesses try to spread themselves too thin, just generally, that's when they get into trouble. And I think our industry is really good at providing essential services and a network. And I think there's a lot of innovation to be done around that network. I think there's a lot of service offerings to be done around that network. I think it can be a very valuable business model. Tom, I think there's a parallel here. AT&T. AT&T is a very different business than they were even 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago. So it's that evolution, I think. We have to know at some point we may not be selling electricity. We're selling wire services. Because if we fight the innovation, you're going to have major breakpoints. That's what you've seen in industry after industry that's been through a change process. If we embrace it and we manage to it, I think we can have a thriving industry instead of having breakpoints. Instead of having guerrilla warfare around the edges all the time, kind of like what's going on now, as you see between the utilities and the solar developers as an example. It's going to happen. The regulators can't stop it. The utilities can't stop it. So if it's going to happen, what do we do? And I think that's the question to be asked.
Nick Akins, AEP.
There's this notion of two different paths that the utility can move on. One is being a distribution system operator that doesn't have a connection with the customer, that only provides the platform for plug-and-play technologies. The other, in my opinion, is the customers are still engaged with the utility. Of course, we're providing the platform, but we're also providing those unique customer solutions and broad universal scale customer solutions that benefit society as a whole. I'm with the latter. I disagree with the former, and here's why. I think that the technologies and the interoperability of the grid are becoming so convoluted that you've got to be able to work with the customer on their specific needs to address how technology is deployed. And in fact, if you're moving toward universal access and the benefits associated with that, the utility has to be involved. So I believe that connection with the customer is very, very important, and that's why we're not asset-driven, we're customer-driven.
Ralph Izzo, PSEG.
Somewhere, somehow, once upon a time, an imaginary boundary was drawn at the meter. We define those boundaries in terms of any infrastructure investment that brings with it a policy objective that's been identified by elected officials and regulators as something that they want to achieve, whether that is simply universal access to electricity or universal access to clean electricity or lower bills. If there's an infrastructure investment that can help us achieve that social objective that the market is not delivering, that's an important caveat, then I've made the case that the regulated utility has a role in delivering that. And so that's manifested itself in us doing grid-connected solar, in us doing energy efficiency on the customer side of the premise, in addition to our core responsibilities, which is highly reliable and environmentally friendly production and delivery of electricity.
Mr. Tom Fanning, CEO of Southern Company in Atlanta, at the time the incoming chairman of EEI.
I want to be their trusted energy provider. Traditionally, this industry has been built by making, moving, and selling energy, with the endpoint of that being focused on a meter. And a customer was on the other side of a meter, so they would procure energy, therms or electrons, through a meter, and then they would do something with it. Today, because the digital economy is growing like crazy, because technology is enabling it and because customers are requiring it, we are now obviating the meter. And this notion of make, move, sell in front of the meter will likely always exist, but now we see make, move, and sell jumping over the meter and being located on the customer premise.
Yeah.
Customers really don't want to get in our business. I don't think. They want to focus on what they're good at. If you imagine a home, it could be a distributed generation in the form of a panel, it could be a fuel cell, it could be a storage device like a Tesla Powerwall, could be gas or electric charging stations for transportation, could be a fuel cell, could be a smart meter, could be backup generation, could be a microgrid. And you can put this either at a home, a business, or an industrial setting.
Tony Early, PG&E in San Francisco.
We see an evolution occurring right now. Utilities more and more are going to be getting out of the generation business or certainly backing away. I mean, we see, particularly in California, our electric generation load declining because of a whole bunch of factors. One is technology. So you've got large-scale solar. You've got private solar on rooftops. You've got community choice aggregation in California where communities can band together and they can buy their power from whoever they want. Our future is less in the generation field and more in making sure the grid is capable of handling all of the innovation that's occurring. People who buy rooftop solar units think, oh, I'm off the grid. They are not off the grid. They are some of the heaviest users of the grid because they're putting power in, they're taking power out. They've got to have their voltage regulated because they're causing voltage fluctuations, so they need smart inverters. And we want to be the player that keeps designing and innovating on the grid to make sure that it can accommodate the next best thing that comes along.
We'll be right back with segment 4, collaboration with disruptors, and how utilities are partnering with the technologists on innovation and solutions. We're back with segment 4, collaboration with disruptors, and how utilities are partnering with the technologists on innovation and solutions. Warner Baxter, CEO of Ameren, kicks us off in this segment.
One of the things we've realized as this industry continues to evolve is that, we don't have to be the innovator. What we need to do is perhaps partner or have strategic alliances with other innovators. And we can be the key enabler to that innovator who has this incredibly great idea that we can deliver value to the customers through our knowledge of the grid, our expertise, and deliver it to them, working hand in hand in some form or fashion.
Mr. Jim Pyro, CEO of Portland General Electric in Portland, Oregon.
I think from the customer's perspective, which is the way we always need to look at it, the kind of technology that's out there to help customers use our product more efficiently, effectively is probably the most exciting part. And I think our view is, as a utility and energy company, we're not going to necessarily invent those technologies, but what we really want to do is partner with those people who come up with those technologies to work with them to provide a value-added solution to our customers. And a prime example of that is we're working with Nest on a demand-side program, and we don't own that thermostat or the technology, but we really want to partner with them to deliver our customers a solution that helps them use our product more efficiently and gives them more control. That's just one example. Electric vehicles is another example where our customers see the value of an electric vehicle. Our job is to help educate them on the value of an electric vehicle, maybe provide the infrastructure for them to charge, but ultimately to make sure they charge it at the right time to get the greatest value. Other technologies we work on are with our customers on energy efficiency. Now, we don't necessarily deliver energy efficiency, but again, we work with our customers and educate them on where those opportunities exist. So again, they can connect with the right incentive programs so they can get those programs put in place to make their business more competitive. Those are just a few examples. We're working on battery technology, pretty interesting. I don't think it's ready for prime time, but we need to be smart about learning about it. There is a place in the integrated grid for batteries. We put in a 5 megawatt battery pilot program in Salem, in the southern part of our system, and we're learning how to use those batteries in a way to improve frequency and provide ancillary services to our grid.
We'll be right back with segment 5, regulatory barriers and enablers to innovation. back with segment 5, regulatory barriers and enablers to innovation. We'll begin with Travis Kavula, president of NARUC and commissioner of the Montana PSC.
Software solution. And that brings up another rate-making complication, which is in the typical utility business model, utilities earn money. They get back their operating expenses dollar for dollar. If I pay Bob $100,000 to manage accounts for my utility, my regulator sets rates that are calibrated to allow me $100,000 to cover. I don't make a profit on Bob.
Right.
I don't make a profit or much of a profit on my computer system. I make basically no profit on software if I'm not allowed to capitalize it anyways. I make a profit when I invest capital dollars in utility plant that has a long lifespan. And the traditional utility revenue model is one where I invest $1 and I get that dollar back over time through depreciation expense that's built into rates, and I earn an annual return at a certain allowed percentage on the unamortized balance. So when you're talking about whether or not a utility would like to build a shiny new power plant or invest in a cloud computing system that helps them avoid transmission failures and promotes a reduction in line loss or helps all of those power plants operate more efficiently, the natural revenue incentive will be in investing in the shiny new plant. It will be to overbuild. So and this is something utility regulators are grappling with, both in the New York REV proceeding, the Reforming the Energy Vision, and elsewhere in the country, of how do you make sure that utilities actually have a financial incentive in unlocking the kind of, say, the big data solutions that have become commonplace in the financial industry, for instance.
Right. Pedro Pizarro, Edison International.
I mentioned the DRP proceeding in California. In that proceeding, we outline a set of investments that we believe need to be made in the near term to make the grid more robust so that it can have more handling capacity, integration capacity for distributed resources, and also to make the grid smarter, better communications, more bandwidth to handle more devices, more sensors, more controls out in the field. It's new for the utilities, it's new for customers and third parties. It's also new for the regulatory staffs that have to ensure that they're following good due process and how they work through all the evaluation and consideration of all these different proposals coming their way. So there's a lot of work yet to be done, not only in terms of the concepts, but in terms of aligning the regulatory processes to match the speed with which I think technology is coming our way.
Alex Lasky, O-Power.
We've built out all of this infrastructure, and very little of its capabilities ever get used or regularly get used. The same is true for Airbnb, which does in hospitality, I think, even a sort of clearer example of this. We're sitting in a Sheraton hotel. If you take all of the Starwood hotels, including Sheraton, and you add all the Marriott hotels, and I think you added the Hyatt hotels to them too, you still would not get as many rooms or as many beds as Airbnb books every night. But Airbnb doesn't own a single one of those beds, but they just take advantage of existing infrastructure. Maybe it's a second home or a spare bedroom that you're renting out to somebody else. And they're able to aggregate that and be a market maker. I think the same opportunity exists for utilities, and I think ultimately that's where the industry has to go. That we have this multi-trillion-dollar investment in a grid that exists. And it's going to require far more investment to stay advanced and upgraded over time, particularly as more renewables and so on come onto the grid and other distributed energy resources. But what utilities ought to be rewarded for, and if you look historically, what they're rewarded for is building that grid and continuing to invest capital. And in a world where there's ever increasing demand for the product and where you have a central generating plant and you just have sort of not even customers, but just ratepayers on the other end who just need the product. It kind of makes sense to just reward them for capital. But in a world where revenues are flat or declining, and where it's no longer this unidirectional grid, but a bidirectional grid that's needed, I think it's quite clear that utilities need to be rewarded not for investing capital, but for making better use and great use of the existing asset class. So you have this grid, utilities should be rewarded for using it efficiently. And that may mean energy efficiency and demand response. It may be creating incentives for people to put PV on their roofs in the parts of the grid where it's needed most and at the times of day that it's needed most. That's the huge opportunity. You asked in the beginning, we were talking about this sort of what are the products and technologies and innovations I'm most excited about. The innovations that I'm most excited about all have to do with the movement towards a more efficient and effective use of the grid.
We'll be right back with segment 6. Are we pushing hard enough? We're back with segment 6. Are we pushing hard enough to innovate? Travis Kavula, president of NARUC and commissioner of the Montana PSC, will lead us off.
No, it's a very risk-averse industry, and there are actually good reasons from a financial and economic theory perspective why they would. I don't know that I want my utility out there trying to invent things. I want them, though, being cognizant of technologies that are being commercialized or about to be, being at least 1 or 2 years ahead of the curve.
Nick Akins, AEP.
5-10 years ago, we were putting in smart meters, and we invested in smart meters, and there was a lot of smart grid pilots that were occurring, and I sort of compare it to having an iPhone without the apps. And we had plenty of iPhones, we didn't have the apps. Today we have the apps, and I think you can show benefits in terms of that, but also I think the context of commissions and regulatory side being much more progressive in terms of what they enable to be built on the systems. The key issue is on the regulated side, where universal access can be provided for all consumers. That's where we need to unlock the ability to be able to react as quickly as customers want us to react. Because right now you're tied up with tariff structures that you have to go through, the regulatory agencies to get approval, and it takes a long period of time. Well, the market's moving faster than that. And we need to be able to address unique customer solutions, even on the regulated side, to put in these various technologies. That way we can advance it for all consumers. You have a great opportunity to get the regulatory side changed where you can advance it quickly. And I was admonished by one of my board members that lived through the telecommunications side of things, and it was, don't let the regulator slow you down, otherwise you will become that dinosaur. And we intend on that not happening. The regulators trust us, but they need that added benefit of knowing this is what our consumers want. This is what the voters want. And then you can carry the day. But I do think the big data analytics and the big data solutions are contributing so much to the apps being added to the iPhone.
Mr. Jim Pyro, CEO of Portland General Electric.
So here's our strategy, and I think we've been very open with the regulators on this, is we want to start with pilots. We use pilots as a way to prove out the technology. Prove out the technology, show them the business case, and then have a deployment plan on how we deploy that technology. Most of that has been on the grid side, but we're also doing that again with the demand side. We're trying to look at those technologies. Again, do a pilot, show the business case, show the economic value, and then move it forward. And I think that's been our plan throughout this process, and I think it's worked very well. And it's a way to bring the regulators along to see the value proposition for customers. It's also a chance for customers to see the value, because we need to have them at the table with our regulators saying, we want to deploy this technology, and we trust the utilities to help partner with us to deploy those technologies. At the end of the day, demand response programs have to be integrated into our system so that we can capture the value. We need to have full control so they meet all the requirements of NERC, and they meet the requirements so that we can count it towards reserves or whatever we're using them for, or for peak demand in terms of resource efficiency. So I think it's been a good strategy. I think our regulators, they're cautious. They want to make sure that things work. At the end of the day, they're not willing to just throw a lot of money at things unless they prove out. Like smart meters, we studied that for a number of years before we actually deployed them, did a number of pilots, learned, waited for the technology to get to a point. Same thing with LED lights, street lights, same thing. We tested a bunch, we showed people what they look like, and then when we got convinced they were the kind of product we wanted to deploy, we then went forward to our cities and said, we can deploy it for you, or you can deploy it. We have options for you, and we went forward, and we've done that very successfully.
Tom Fanning, CEO of Southern Company.
Who knows our business better than us? Shame on us if we say it can't be done. Number two, shame on us if we don't provide avenues, regimes, structures in which this can benefit everybody. If all you do is let that innovation occur somewhere else, if we don't take accountability for it, well, it's like the old, the lesson at least that I always associate with barbarians at the gate. Remember the story?
Yeah, of course.
Takeover of RJR Nabisco? If I had to take one story, one line away from that book, and I've tried to spread it, it's in here, I tried to spread it throughout Southern. If you don't run your business as well as you can, somebody will. And so it's our accountability. Oh yeah, it doesn't work right now. We'll figure out a way to make it work. And that's what we try and do. So there is innovation in a technology, there's innovation in a business model, and there's innovation in a regulatory structure. So that's as regulatory entrepreneurship. A lot of times in our industry, people will say, well, the regulator won't let us do that. If there is a good business case for clean, safe, reliable, affordable, for the customer's benefit, then I want to be the entrepreneur that creates regulatory structures, working with our regulators to make that happen, all for the customer's benefit.
We'll be right back with our final segment, segment 7, parting thoughts and advice to stakeholders. Stay tuned. We're back with segment 7, parting thoughts and advice to stakeholders. And it's a fitting coincidence that our 3 guests with the parting words are those that have transitioned since my interview with them last year. One through sale of company, one through executive retirement, and the other through expiration of term of service. Tony Early, PG&E, will take us home from the utility perspective.
As you know, there are people out there saying, the utilities are a thing of the past, and they're dinosaurs.
Policy,
and that may work for a while, but I think a lot of them find out, no, we're going to need the utilities if we're going to get beyond being just a small local company. No matter what you think about how far technology has gone and battery technology, there are very few Americans that are, quote, off the grid. Everyone's on the grid. I think it's conferences like these, as I said, the Edison Electric Institute really focuses on a number of forums for innovators to come to those, to introduce what they're doing. The other is just working with your local utility. And many of them have learned work with the local regulator.
Alex Lasky, who sold his company O-Power to Oracle last year while we interviewed together, will take us home on the technologist side.
If we had 300 years or 200 years or maybe even 100 years to solve this problem, I suspect we probably could solve the problem of climate change and electricity distribution without utilities and without our grid that we have today. But we don't have that kind of time. We have, according to some estimates that are quite credible, we have 5-6 years to really change the way energy is produced, distributed, and consumed in this country and across the globe. And that isn't going to happen unless the utilities are in the lead. And my advice to entrepreneurs, whether they're in this industry or any other, it isn't free of frustration or annoyance to partner with incumbents, but it is impactful. What has to come first is the regulation or the utilities, and I think public policy is changing, is going to change, and it will change with or without the utilities' participation in that change. But my experience now, nearly a decade in this industry, is that the utilities that lean into that process and advocate for a future that they believe in are the ones that succeed.
Finally, Travis Kavula, now former president of NARUC and current commissioner of the Montana Public Service Commission, will take us home and take us to a conclusion from the regulator perspective.
One of the big problems of political economy of regulation is that it's a government office whose main point of exposure to private industry is the entity that they regulate, that they have statutory jurisdiction over. And that business, on the other hand, often derives pretty much all of its revenue through the decisions of this government office. And so the relationship has been one-on-one for so long in the old-fashioned command and control regulatory environment. That's what's led to accusations for 100 years about regulatory capture. And some of those accusations are true, not in the sense that regulators are out there thinking, how can I benefit the utility, but just because they see the utility representatives all the time appearing before them. And inevitably, that lends itself to a closeness that, at least by perception and also in reality, in regulatory quarters. And so, regulators could stand to learn a lesson from the days of telecom regulation in the late 80s and early 1990s, where on the fringes there was all this innovation happening, but they weren't the regulated parties. The regulated party was Ma Bell, which held its regulator close. And I don't think it can really be disputed as a matter of history today that the regulation that purported to be in the consumer's interest in the 80s and 90s, back really since the 1960s in telecommunications, was actually profoundly anti-consumer. That it prevented, for at least a decade, the emergence of technologies like cellular telephony that are now taken for granted entirely. Trying to think about whether, as a network industry, the electric utility space is similar to that,
right,
and if it is, how it's similar, is really important. And that's, I go back to the metering, the advanced metering. We will see inevitably, I think, more and more customers decide to choose technologies that allow them more control of energy, as well as ultimately just deliver them lower bills. Ultimately, regulators aren't responsible for regulating the private conduct of customers, and that's as it should be. We need to at least know, for the purpose of thinking about how our utilities make those long-term investments, what's happening on the other side of the meter, and whether those long-lived central plant investments that are being made right now or might be made next year are in fact necessary in light of what very well may happen on the customer side and the competitive side, over the next 10 years.
I can't think of a more fitting way to close this retrospective than drawing from the opening of Neil Irwin's New York Times article that I mentioned at the outset of this episode. Are you a skeptical economist who believes that we're in a depressing era in which innovation has slowed and living standards are barely rising? Or are you a techno-optimist who believes that our era, in which digital technology is transforming the underpinnings of human existence, is the golden age of innovation? Thanks for joining us. We can't improve without your feedback. Write to us through our website, leadershiplyceum.com, and subscribe on iTunes. See you next time. The Leadership Lyceum, a CEO's virtual mentor, has been a production of the Leadership Lyceum, LLC. Copyright 2017, all rights reserved.